Hello and welcome to the Commodities Institute podcast. I'm Emily Costa. Today is January 15th, 2026, and we have a lot to unpack because global commodity markets are being pulled in multiple directions at once by politics, policy, and price signals. What makes this moment especially interesting is that these stories are not isolated. Oil, agriculture, metals, power, and even dry freight are all reflecting the same underlying tension between state control, market access, and long-term investment risk. Let me start in an unexpected place with oil, but not by talking about prices. Instead, let's talk about power. The United States has now completed its first sales of Venezuelan oil under a new framework that places Washington firmly in control of the country's crude exports. This is extraordinary when you stop and think about it. Venezuela is a founding member of OPEC, a cartel built on the idea of sovereign control over oil policy, and yet its production and sales are now being overseen by a foreign government. President Donald Trump has said he believes it is better for Venezuela to remain inside OPEC, even as he openly acknowledges that it may not be better for the United States. That tension is the heart of this story. On one hand, keeping Venezuela in OPEC preserves the appearance of continuity in global oil governance. On the other hand, US-directed investment aimed at boosting Venezuelan output could put Caracas on a collision course with OPEC quotas, particularly at a time when the group may want to restrict supply to support prices. Chevron sits right at the center of this. The company is expected to receive an expanded license that would allow it to increase production and exports from Venezuela, potentially even trading state oil company barrels if authorized. Chevron is already producing roughly 240,000 barrels per day through joint ventures, and history tells us that when restrictions ease, capacity can come back faster than many expect. Other firms, from refiners like Marathon and Valero to traders like Glencore and Mercuria, are lining up for access to this heavy crude. The message from Washington is clear. The US wants long-term control over Venezuelan oil flows, and it wants private capital to do the rebuilding. President Trump has reportedly urged oil executives to invest as much as $100 billion into reviving the industry. For OPEC, that raises a fundamental question. What happens when one of its members is producing under the strategic direction of a non-member superpower? Now let's shift from oil fields to farmland, because agriculture is dealing with its own credibility crisis. Global grain traders are facing intense skepticism after the collapse of the Amazon soy moratorium, a 2-decade-old pact that helped slow deforestation in Brazil. This agreement was widely regarded as one of the most successful conservation measures ever implemented in commodity supply chains. It worked because it was transparent, collaborative, and verifiable. That system is now unraveling just as new, broader, deforestation-free pledges are supposed to come into force. Traders are replacing a clear-cut ban on soy grown on recently deforested land with looser commitments that allow purchases from land cleared much more recently. Environmental groups argue that without shared data and independent verification, these pledges risk becoming marketing statements rather than enforceable rules. This matters far beyond Brazil. Brazilian soy underpins global meat production, feeding livestock that supplies supermarkets and fast food chains worldwide. If trust in these supply chains erodes, buyers may face pressure to prove their products are truly deforestation-free. Europe is moving ahead with legislation banning imports linked to deforestation after 2020, which could reshape trade flows if compliance systems fall short. Staying with agriculture, but moving from forests to fields, France has revised its wheat export outlook. Shipments outside the European Union have been trimmed slightly, while intra-EU exports are rising, particularly to countries like Germany and Spain. Morocco remains an important destination, but competition is intensifying as Argentina brings a record wheat crop to market. This is a reminder that even modest changes in harvest size or trade policy can quickly alter export hierarchies in global grain markets. In India, cotton tells another story about policy-driven trade flows. Imports surged 158% year-on-year in the December quarter after the government allowed duty-free imports. That pushed overseas purchases to a record level and is expected to support global cotton prices, even as it pressures domestic markets. India is balancing the needs of its massive textile workforce against crop damage and weak export demand, all while navigating higher tariffs imposed by the United States on Indian textiles. From there, let's move into metals, where strategy and timing are under scrutiny. President Trump has decided, at least for now, not to impose tariffs on critical minerals such as rare earths and lithium. Instead, the administration is seeking negotiated supply arrangements with international partners and exploring the idea of price floors. This is a tacit admission that the United States is far from self-sufficient in the minerals that underpin electric vehicles, renewable energy, and advanced electronics. China's dominance in both mining and refining remains a core vulnerability. The administration's own assessment concludes that domestic mining alone does not guarantee security if processing capacity sits offshore. For miners, price floors could offer stability, but for manufacturers they could mean higher input costs. Either way, this is a significant shift from blunt tariffs toward more managed trade mechanisms. At the corporate level, metals are also making headlines through consolidation. Rio Tinto's potential tie-up with Glencore would create the world's largest mining company, valued at more than $200 billion. Australian investors are wary, questioning whether buying assets at the top of the cycle, particularly in copper, will truly create value. History is full of mining mergers that looked brilliant at peak prices and painful once the cycle turned. Let's turn now to carbon and power, where billions of dollars are at stake and uncertainty is the dominant theme. In the United Kingdom, RWE has agreed to sell half of its Norfolk offshore wind projects to KKR. These projects alone require more than $15 billion in development and capital spending and are expected to power around 3 million homes by the end of the decade. This kind of partnership reflects how capital-intensive the energy transition has become, with developers increasingly sharing risk to move projects forward. Across the Atlantic, the mood is far less settled. A US judge is set to rule on whether Equinor can resume construction of the Empire Wind project off New York. The Trump administration's pause on offshore wind, citing national security concerns, has thrown the sector into legal limbo. Developers argue that delays threaten the viability of projects that are already billions of dollars invested and more than halfway complete. The courts may allow construction to continue, but the broader policy uncertainty is unlikely to disappear. Finally, let's touch briefly on dry freight. Jordan has returned to the market to buy feed barley, securing about 60,000 metric tons, with more tenders expected. These routine purchases may seem small, but they reflect steady demand that underpins freight flows in the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions, especially at a time when larger grain trade routes are being reshaped by policy and harvest outcomes. When you step back, a common thread emerges across all these markets. Governments are asserting greater control, whether through sanctions, licenses, tariffs deferred or imposed, or environmental rules tightened and loosened. For producers, traders, and investors, the challenge is navigating not just supply and demand, but shifting political priorities that can redefine markets overnight. That's what makes this such a critical moment for commodities. Prices still matter, but power, policy, and perception are increasingly driving outcomes. As always, we'll keep tracking how these forces play out across energy, agriculture, metals, and beyond. That's it for today's episode of the Commodities Institute podcast. If you found this episode valuable, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave a review.